Good morning and good afternoon, and welcome once again to the third installment of PwC's ESG Week webinars. For those of you joining us for the first time, my name is Kevin Cambridge, and I'm the ESG partner as well as the advisory partner for PwC Bahamas. Just to give a bit of a recap, on day one, we looked at ESG regulation pertaining mainly to the shift in the landscape from a sort of voluntary to a more mandatory reporting environment. Day two, which was yesterday, we focused on upskilling and from the perspective of internally upskilling as well as looking externally to our clients and prospective clients. Today, we'll be focusing on the financial services agenda, ESG, climate risk, and growth opportunities. The financial services agenda more or less has increased in terms of the agreement and the importance of ESG and ESG social governance. Factors for financial institutions and opportunities and reaping benefits and acting long-term have become the norm rather than the exception. This panel will discuss ESG concepts of particular relevance to the financial services sector, including industry and regulatory trends, climate risk, the potential impact of sector and future sustainability, among other pertinent timely issues. In addition, the discussion will aim to address practical first steps that financial services organizations can take proactively to mitigate climate risk and capitalize on growth opportunities. As a matter of housekeeping, all of the videos will be uploaded to the portal and they will be made available via YouTube. And before I introduce my illustrious panel, I just want to say that you can also participate actively by putting your questions right below the video panel. So as a matter of introduction, I'd like to introduce and welcome more or less John Newsom and Kelly Dawson. John is a director for PwC's sustainability team in the UK. He works with our financial services clients to help understand the impact of existing and emerging sustainability reporting requirements on their investors, product strategy, operating model, and controls. The areas of expertise include TCFD, SFDR, SDR, and other EU and UK sustainability regulations. John's also an experienced regulatory change and compliance expert, having spent 12 years at PwC, helping firms implement new regulations, set up new compliance functions, and review maturity of effectiveness of existing compliance functions. Before joining PwC, John was a regulator, spending 5 years in authorizations and supervisions teams in the Financial Services Authority. Welcome, John. Kelly Dawson. Kelly is a partner with our PwC office in Cayman for over 18 years. She's the sustainability leader and risk regulatory leader for the Cayman Islands and modeling leader for the Caribbean region. Kelly takes a practical approach to solving clients' emerging complex problems. She has assisted for over 50 financial institutions within the Caribbean to adopt international accounting standards such as IFRS 9, 17, and has recently assisted Caribbean banks to develop credit models to integrate related risks within their regulatory returns. Thank you very much for joining me, and welcome once again, John and Kelly. I think, John, Kelly, I'm going to jump right into it. I use the term elephant in the room, but we can't escape it. COP28, which begins this week, in fact, tomorrow. From both of your perspectives, where will PwC be in terms of advancing meaningful action addressing climate and nature crisis? And what are your thoughts on this year's COP and what you hope to see coming out of it?
Shall I go first, Kelly?
Go ahead, John.
I think there's a lot on the agenda this year, as always with COP. So most of the focus this year will be on energy. So there's some sort of headline agreements that are part of COP28. So an agreement to phase out all fossil fuels is one of the objectives. I think that's quite unlikely to sort of get much traction and actually go very far. There's going to be quite a focus on increasing use of renewable energy, which is far more likely to get greater support from most nations across the globe. So something more easy for countries to support, and also allows greater financing and opportunities for firms in financial services and other sectors to provide financing for renewable energy and actually sort of use that as an opportunity to increase investment returns. I think one of the big focuses, which we may come back to, will be the loss and damage fund. and really trying to operationalize that after it was announced last year to quite a big fanfare, but hasn't actually achieved much since then. I think there'll be quite a focus on sort of increasing the amount of financing around climate change. So there's always been an objective to deliver $100 billion a year on climate financing. We look like we're probably thereabouts now. And so what's going to be next? What's the next big goal? So I think they're going to be the sort of focus areas of it. As ever with all of these sorts of groups, much of the thinking, discussions, and big debates will in all likelihood have happened already or be part of sort of separate conversations within it. But I think we'll have to sort of wait until the end until we see what's going to be the big headline announcement. There's always something that comes out of each of the COPs that is the sort of big headline piece that everyone can sort of stand behind. Loss and damage fund last year. I think this year probably be something around renewable energy or increasing the funding for climate finance.
Yeah, and just John, maybe I'll just run on that because I think that second part around the financing and having that available to developing nations to deal with climate crisis and then climate sustainability development is quite interesting. And I think it's the one part that the Caribbean can actually get on the global stage here. Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister from Barbados, has always been a champion around this, and she's really been a strong voice from the Caribbean that represents a lot of, shines a spotlight on the Caribbean as far as the impacts that we've had from a climate crisis perspective and the impact that hurricanes and climate-related events can occur. So I think it's just interesting to see her on that international stage and start to see the Caribbean's perspective on these major global events.
Yeah. No, thank you both for that contribution. And John, we'll be coming back to the loss and damage fund discussion and also Kelly touching on what we've been seeing from Minister Motley as well. Another question to both of you. What do you see as the main issues in climate finance on the table at COP28?
So I think from my perspective, what we hear, the big challenge with all of these things is matching up governmental objectives for finance in any area with what firms actually want to do. Because I think it's fine from a governmental perspective to, if they want to provide the climate finance, then that can achieve a goal. I think otherwise it's easy for them to create lofty objectives of X amount of financing in a certain area. But the firms that are going to provide this financing are basically going to be financial services firms, and banks, asset management type firms, investment funds need a return on this investment. They're not providing it in general for only positive reasons for a positive impactful outcome. They're providing it because they have an objective to receive return, plus meet some other objectives they may have around environmental, climate change type issues. And I think that's often the challenge with these sorts of things is you need to make sure that you're also bringing along the banks, the investment funds with you in those sorts of decisions so that they actually are willing to provide that financing. Now, there's a whole host of regulation that I can get onto later that is pushing firms into that area and making it easier to provide climate financing. But you kind of need those drivers to achieve it. And some of that might be tax benefits or other benefits that the government can provide to enable that sort of facilitation of finance. But you need those UK, US, global banks to really be willing to finance it and to sort of be able to see the demonstrable upside of that financing alongside, the clear benefits from a sort of global person perspective, if I put it that way.
Yeah. Kelly, from your perspective, in terms of what the main issues you feel will be in climate finance?
Well, I think there's been one John touched on that emerging of sustainability reporting. And I think that's where we're going to see in the financial service sector over the next 3, 5, 10 years, some major uplift, change, an adjustment required by financial service organizations. And I think we talk about this big global scale and the largest financing efforts around the globe. And what does that mean for our Caribbean clients that are located and servicing regional? I think we need to take a peek into that and understand how do these global trends start to impact our clients. And we might not be on the same timeline as some of the largest multinational organizations with the same kind of financial reporting pressure that we'll face locally. And so what do organizations do here, looking at the global trends and themes, to adjust that to say, practically, what do I do now? And what's coming down the pipeline as we see the largest organizations try to tackle these very complex problems around sustainability reporting now?
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. And we saw that a few days ago. We spoke to some of the regulations, and the question was posed as to sort of the relevance, particularly to the region, and in terms of how we adopt. And the example was given S1 and S2. To what extent? And I think to your point, it really does take a different lens when you look at the regional reaction to it compared to maybe sort of our global offices. And to both of your compliments, that's why it's probably very good for us to have diversity in our panels, because we get to flesh out, obviously, both sides of that equation. John, you touched on it earlier. In last year's COP27, we saw the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund, which was really highlighted at the conference. The fund aims to provide financial assistance to nations most vulnerable and impacted through the effects of climate change. Historically, though, and we all know this, that the international adoption in terms of finance flows from developed countries are way below the estimated needs. How effective do you feel that the L&D fund will be, especially in light of discussions around who will contribute to the benefit of the fund?
Yeah, and I think, so yeah, you're right. Established last year, it was sort of the standout announcement, I think, post COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, that this fund was going to be established and do exactly what you say there, Kevin. So providing financing to those most impacted by climate change, who are also, in general, those that have contributed to climate change the least. You kind of have that uneven outcome of other countries are the ones that have contributed to it most, that are the least impacted generally. And it's something we see across a lot of our clients, that I've worked with a number of asset managers with funds in the Caribbean and establishments there that are concerned about the impact of climate change on their supply chain or their service providers, because they use a lot of functions in Bangladesh, and a lot of Bangladesh may be underwater in future. Same if you're outsourced to any other area like that, like Pakistan. I think there's huge challenges on how the fund. So I think the fund, really important, really great sort of objectives to it. I think there's probably a number of issues with how it will be created and sort of coin a consulting-esque phrase, operationalized. Where does the financing come from? I think the World Bank has agreed for the next few years that it will run and sort of house the fund. But really, where does that financing come from for it to actually make it achieve what it's sought to achieve? There's ideas around adding climate tax to, high emitting companies and investments. Lots of things about that, often country by country as much as at a global level. Hard to see how that would be implemented. And just that piece of who finances it and how and what is any, if any return that they would expect from that financing. I think all of that side is hugely complicated. And then you come to that element of really where does the money go to? There are some fairly simple methods that you could use of a sort of population number. So higher the population of a country, more impacted by climate change, gets more money. Lower your population, you get less. Or you go by a size of country. But both of those factors are almost too simplistic to deal with such a complex issue, because you can take some countries. Pakistan's a great example where it can be caught by two almost contradictory issues of flooding risk because of rising sea levels, but also drought risk, because actually the impact of flooding means that there's less water available. It also then leads to potential starvation, because the flooding will flood all the crops that are being grown. And you kind of face lots of these contradictory issues that are caused by climate change. But you can't just solve that through if population is X, you give it this amount of money and then you divide it by per capita. I think there's a far more complex matrix you need to go through of how you actually split the financing down. I think a lot of that will need to be worked on as well. And then, sorry, just one last thing I'd say as well is that, one of the other challenges of it is how do they assess who is funded by the loss and damage fund? Mm-hmm. One of the ideas is that you would use the 1992 sort of developing country definition used by the UN, but that captures countries, it's 30 years out of date by and large, and it also captures countries that, in the Middle East in particular, that have a far different footprint and outcome today than they did 30 years ago. And so, there's so many of those almost fairly simple things as a starting point of where should this money go that gets very complicated when you go through political issues of who should be considered to be eligible to get this financing, how much of it should they get, and then on the flip side, where is the financing coming from in the first place to provide all of this? So I think it should be hugely positive, but there's a number of just awkward steps that need to be defined and just sort of got out of the way so that we can get to a really good, impactful fund that is, actually making a difference, which clearly is the objective of it.
Yeah, that's great. John, I'll stick with you again with respect to the question of, for example, small island nations, for example, in the Caribbean region, who are at the front line of the effects of climate change. You talk about hurricanes, droughts, floods, rising sea levels, while at the same time not being amongst the contributors or the large contributors to GHG emissions. How is it fair to indicate to these clients that their climate projects are being, receiving difficulty or having difficulty getting funded because each person is going to get too much per capita from their resources? Could you explain that rationale?
Yeah, I think sometimes there's too much of a focus. So there has to be a focus on financing, as in money that countries, places, areas need to adapt and react to the impact of climate change, sort of adaptation financing. I sometimes think, though, that there could be more done around the non-financing methods that would actually help areas like that don't necessarily need or have access to that capital. So there are technology advancements in various areas of the world that could help around solar power. But countries don't have access to the technology to be able to implement a solar power network in the first place to actually deal with an issue that could be resolved through renewable energy rather than needing to rely on fossil fuels. So I think, firstly, I think that I think we can think about the financing side, but also the non-financing side. What is the technology that could be provided that would help places, areas, countries beyond just here's money? And I think I'd go back to the point earlier as well that I don't think you can resolve an issue like climate change, like the multiple impacts that it can have of, as you sort of set out, almost like deforestation, flooding, drought, all of these pieces, that they aren't necessarily just if you have this number of people, this is the impact. If you have a smaller number of people, this is the impact. They're different to that, because as much as anything else, the impact on one country isn't just an impactful on that population. It's impactful on, depending on what you do there, whole other areas of the globe. Even if you just look at, an area that grows lots of crops, you lose access to those crops. You potentially create a global shortage in certain crops. You lose access to sort of holiday destinations and smaller things like that are impactful. So I don't think you can just sort of divide it on a certain population gets access to investment in a certain, more so than others because you have a higher or lower population. I think there's just a few more criteria that you need to apply to it to ensure that funding is actually provided on an impactful basis rather than on a per capita basis, I guess.
Yeah. And Kelly, I didn't forget about you. I'm just trying to keep a train of thought with John, and I'm going to pivot to you right away. John, last question just on this particular topic. For any fund to be effective, of course, the root cause of climate change still needs to be tackled. And it will involve reducing emissions, obviously, and we'll have more countries facing devastating effects of climate change. So we need to look at resources for mitigation, adaptation of loss, damage. I guess the question is, how can financial services institutions in particular help to affect this?
Yeah, so I think if I go back to the reporting piece that we touched on a little bit earlier, and I suspect you got into the other day, if you were looking at S1 and S2 ISSB standards, that if you look at TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, one of the key things of TCFD is this sort of, you look at what are the risks and opportunities for you as a business from climate change, and what is the impact on your business and operations potentially because of climate change of certain sort of different scenarios, 1.5 degree, 2 degree, hothouse world type scenarios that you can apply to the impact on your business. And I think those are really important. That the way I look at any reporting, sustainability reporting is a great example of it, is that there's often something that you put out at the end, the disclosure, the report that you do. But the really more important bit of it is the analysis that you do to get to that reporting stage, which says, well, actually, if we are a bank, what is the risk to us from climate change? And kind of as importantly, what are the opportunities for us? And any of the work that we do in that area, banks and asset managers, insurers are really good at thinking of risk, because they look at risk, they manage risk, they sort of focus on that all the time as part of a business as usual process. Whilst they're clearly always very successful in looking at opportunities, I think we've seen less focus of firms on putting a great deal of thought into what are the climate opportunities that, like the opportunities to us from climate change. And that's about the financing of certain sectors of certain renewable energy approaches, just certain methods that can create long-term value for you. And I think focusing on that piece of thinking about the opportunities for you enables you to actually then provide the access to funding that companies, countries, places need to deal with this as an issue. Because if you're not providing that financing, there's an issue globally. But it's that piece of there's an opportunity here to make money. And I think that's the thing that we often focus on here, is that this isn't just for want of a better phrase, we want to be nice and we want to make a difference. That there's a financial positive return that comes out of this, whether it's increasing the value of a business, of a bank and fund, a company over the short term, or whether it's the long-term value that you create through investing in certain tech, certain sectors that sort of supports the mitigation of climate change, but is a long-term play from an investment perspective. So I think the focus needs to be on that there's a huge positive outcome here financially, potentially, if you get this stuff right, as much as there is this is a nice, good thing to do. Because if you focus on that side, you kind of lose track of we're here to make money. We have ESG objectives, potentially we don't, but actually we're here to make money. And I think that's a really important piece. And there's a lot of evidence that will show that the more you focus on ESG investing and ESG financing, the greater the return it actually creates for you.
It really is. It sounds almost like a bit of an ecosystem in terms of how you view that question. And thank you very much for that answer. So Kelly, now I'll pivot to you. Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, presented a comprehensive approach to develop finance last summer, the Bridgetown Initiative. And it developed a collaboration with the United Nations, and it's a plan to mobilize short-term liquidity for crisis response and long-term funding for sustainable development. In other words, it targets the financing problem by creating more sources from which the developing countries can borrow to mitigate and recover from the climate crisis. Is this alongside the existing vehicles enough to bridge the gap in your view, Kelly?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I'm going to touch on that last point that John mentioned. So I think when we look at initiatives and when they get launched, they are in the best interest, and a lot of it is a nice thing to do. But successful initiatives really come with sustainable outcomes. and they can be measured, and you can bridge that gap and say, where are we starting versus where are we going? I think there's two parts there. The short-term crisis, you can see, okay, there's the need, how do we help, and what's the result of that? I think that long-term funding for sustainable development is there's challenges around that. So is the capital flowing to the BESH initiative making the most impact? And I think where there's wasted capital or where it's not being developed enough, it is when we're not looking at the biggest impact and you're not able to measure the results of how is that capital being used. So I think, to say, does it bridge the gap? I think there's each organization or country across the Caribbean is on their own sustainable development journey. I would say you see different progress across the Caribbean as far as the investment in transitions of energy sources, the initiatives of organizations, how much is sustainability integrated both at a government level and then a private sector level. I think there's a lot to be done there, but I think any successful initiative comes with very robust reporting, goals, and then measurement of those goals. And so I think if we're able to see that, then it's going to be a large success.
Yeah, thank you. And sticking with you, Kelly, I mean, I mentioned day one where we looked at ESG regulation and did quite a deep dive. We've seen the issuance of sustainability reporting guidance. We touched on the EU, IFRS, SEC. You've assisted, Kelly, some of your Caribbean clients to adopt new accounting standards over the past 5 years. How do you see this developing in terms of, from the perspective of how do you think it will impact Caribbean clients?
I hear a lot of questions and concerns about how does this impact us? We're small nations, we're small organizations, and I think it will have a trickle-down effect, right? So we've seen this with other standards when you have the largest organizations investing in coming up with the data, creating the ecosystem, never mind the technology that needs to come across when you're doing sustainability reporting. The controls around the completeness and accuracy of this data. I think there's going to be a lot of estimates in the initial data. We're creating a whole ecosystem of data that's never been subject to the level of scrutiny that we're looking at in the past. I always kind of raise the fact that there's a lot of organizations globally that issue wonderful glossy sustainability reports. Those have never been subject to any scrutiny, and the impact of getting those sustainability reports wrong and then having a different message being relayed in your financial statements or to key stakeholders has maybe a larger negative impact than what they initially thought these sustainability reports benefited in right now. And so I think there's, for the Caribbean clients that are regional, I think look ahead as far as what are the large multinationals doing. Understand 360 your environment as far as who could be asking for some information. I think John touched on that kind of through the cycle and through if you have global stakeholders, they might be asking for information from you as from an investment perspective. So I think it's just a wait and see right now for the Caribbean, but there's some things that you can do to prepare for the data, for the questions that will be coming. And I think thinking about those things and having it on your radar is definitely an urgent activity that should be conducted now.
Yeah. And your response, Kelly, is very much aligned with the results we've seen in our 2022 corporate governance and ESG survey, in that the nexus, or those multinational companies in the region, have a bit of a head start because, to your point, they are reporting upward to the parent. Whereas, to your point, the radar, or for companies that are more Caribbean or regionally focused, they do have to keep it on their radars and look at steps to make sure that they're well aligned going forward. Sticking in that same vein, with the new accounting standards, what do you see as the largest challenges, or what are the largest challenges for organizations in your view, Kelly?
I think for the Caribbean, it's that data, and really step one, understanding what's your story, who are your stakeholders, what do they care about? I think that what do they care about is a big question that I think I've heard boardrooms have conversations and they're guessing, right? And what I don't like around ESG is that fluffy aspect of it, right? I like the data. I like what the numbers tell me about that. And so how do you collect some data on your stakeholders and hear what do they care about and how am I doing against what I care about? And so having an understanding of that creates a clear vision and a priority of the aspects of ESG that your key stakeholders care about. If that's customers, if that's employees, if that's your investors, your shareholders, you need to be very clear on what that is and make sure that throughout holistically your organization, that those messages come through. You need to be consistent and authentic about those messages. I think in the Caribbean, regional banks and local banks play a larger role in society compared to some of the more other nations, and they play a very large role in the community. And so how do you play that role and make sure that everyone's seeing the messages around ESG that you want to convey?
Yeah. Kelly, you mentioned the challenge around organizations to be clear, have a clear view of their stakeholders and then priorities. But how are organizations gaining an understanding of their stakeholders from your vantage point?
So I've actually seen a couple things occur. Some organizations, talk about it in the boardroom or talk about it with the executive management as far as what do they care about. But where I've seen the most success is when you're running surveys using some of the sustainable development goals developed by the UN to convey what are your priorities, because the sustainable development goals are pretty easy to understand. It doesn't take a large educational curve to understand what those priorities are. People know if they care about education, they know if they care about clean access to water. And so it's those things that are very clear and transparent. And if you've got a pulse on what do your stakeholders care about and how is the organization doing against those priorities, and you get some numbers and some rankings around that, I think that's a very helpful tool to start developing ESG strategies to really make sure that you're spending the right time, effort, and money against those priorities to make the biggest impact.
Yeah, it's interesting because you do mention the boards, and I take it back to day one where there was a statistic that was raised, something along the lines that from our 2022 ESG corporate governance survey, 60% of the board surveyed said that ESG was definitely something that they saw as important in terms of the strategy moving forward, but less than a third of them had ESG as a recurring item on their agendas, which, to my point or to your point, shows that there's a bit of a delta or a gap that needs to be closed. This question I'll pose to both. Go ahead, Kelly.
No, I think that's exactly right, is people know that they want to talk about ESG. Yeah. They know it needs to be something they need to deal with. But ESG means many different things to different people. People are dropping ESG and just calling it sustainability. And so it's become a very, how do you clarify what are the priorities to people so that everybody in the boardroom or in executive management is talking about the same thing and we have a clear dialogue, because there's a lot of aspects of ESG. And so what's the priority to your organization?
Yeah, it was interesting. One board in particular just asked me a question along the lines of, can we just rebrand our CSR activities? And I said, well, no, no, you can't. This question is actually going to be posed to both of you in terms of, how will traditional finance paradigms need to change in the coming years from your vantage point?
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, so I think there's going to be, in some ways, a huge focus on financial firms deglobalizing their model. One of the things we see from our clients in UK and Europe is that a lot of them are taking a very different approach at the moment, depending on the country they are selling into, because investors, clients, people in those countries have very different views of how you should tackle climate change. And so I think that just leads to, we've seen a huge focus over the last 30, however long years, of globalization being the model. Let's sort of standardize everything. Actually, I think the future in this area, in a lot of places, is we need a very different approach. We need to have different objectives in different countries because people want different things. And actually, you can split that down country by country, person by person in each country. And technology is going to facilitate that as well in allowing financial firms to far better make available products, solutions that are personalized for different clients through blockchain and tokenization and things like that. So I think a lot of the future is around that, is that sort of deglobalization. If you look at regulation, it's exactly the same. We have some global standards, the ISSB, S1, S2, great examples of that, but limited adoption so far. We're early on in that, but limited adoption so far of those. And otherwise, we see very different approaches in Europe to US in how they want to tackle climate change issues, with long delayed SEC climate rule coming at some point in the US. So I think all of that just means that firms need a really different approach here. So I think the future of that is taking a differentiated approach on what products you make available, and then actually where you invest and the type of investment financing you provide. I think if you look at the last 5 years, probably been a great rise of loan funds, so investment funds providing financing rather than companies having to go to banks. I would expect that to increase as well, and it will see a lot more loan funds continue to rise because traditional private equity managers in particular see that that's a new market they can enter into that they haven't entered into in the past. They've had limited access to in the past. So I think all of those things is where the market will change and where the financing model will change around, generally as much as around sustainability.
And also to add to that, John, and agree with you 100%. And I think even to bring it home to the Caribbean region, if you are, in fact, and you see it when you speak to boards locally and in the region, if you are a board that is, or an organization that's part of a supply chain internationally, that then heightens, obviously, a lot of what you said in terms of not even looking just locally, but looking globally. Kelly, any views with respect to sort of how the traditional finance paradigm needs to change in the coming years?
I would say I do think the fundamentals of making sure you're getting the highest return on your capital is going to stay the exact same, right? And so, again, it's lovely. It's a nice thing to do, but no one's going to do the nice thing if it doesn't provide a return. And I don't think those fundamentals are changing. I think it is the KPIs around telling that story is going to emerge. And I think those KPIs need to be very tailored, right? So if I think about if I'm a fund and I'm investing in maybe a very carbon heavy organization and I'm looking to transition that organization, maybe it's that how much do I change my impact on my carbon footprint there, right? And so there's a story there. I think making sure that story aligns with the data, that's going to be critical. And I do think that naturally the capital will flow to the investments or funds that will have the highest return. And naturally, if there's ESG integrated in that, we're seeing those returns are high. So I think it is the fundamentals of capital is not going to change. I think it's just the story, the KPIs that are going to evolve around that. And as investor demand evolves, as we're seeing investors in the younger generation become very conscious with their capital, I think the natural return will come there.
Thank you both. So we're coming into the bit of a home stretch now, and when I close, I like to open the floor to my panelists to really share, because we really shared quite a bit, and thank you. You shared a lot of thought-provoking information. But are there 3 takeaways? I mean, considering what we discussed on the panel today, are there 3 takeaways from the session that you would like to sort of double down or underscore for our viewing and listening audience? Maybe John?
Yeah, I think if I sort of look back at what I've been talking about, I think the most important thing for me is that focus on return, and that this isn't any financing provided here isn't just a thing to do nicely. It's because we see, and our clients see, a lot of positive returns out of this financially. Second thing is, I think, like, I'm sure something will come out, but almost don't expect too much of a grandstanding announcement from COP28 from what I see at the moment, and from what we've been looking at, and we're quite closely involved in a lot of the debates from a PwC perspective, and our teams that are in COP at the moment in Dubai. I'm sure something will come out, because as I sort of said earlier on, I think each of these, there's always some grand announcement. And I think the third thing is just the focus on the fund, the loss and damage fund, that we really need to get that operationalized to actually make it effective, because clearly in anything here, the impact is felt by actually doing this stuff, rather than just the initial announcement that it's being created, because without actually doing anything off the back of that, it's a sort of empty announcement. So I think really need to get that up and running and actually workable. And we need, particularly whether it's governments, whether it's companies operating in those countries that are the flip side, the high greenhouse gas emitting countries and low impact from climate change, you really need those to lean into it and get it operational, get it working, because without their buy-in, it won't be as successful as it could be. So I think those are sort of the three things that I'd look back on.
Thank you. Kelly, a few takeaways from your vantage point?
Yeah, I'm going to assume a lot of our listeners are Caribbean-based in the financial service sector. So if I'm sitting there on the other side of the client side, I'm thinking, okay, what can I do tomorrow? One, how do I make sure I'm aligned on my ESG strategy? Does everyone in the boardroom have clear priorities around what ESG is? Have I taken stock 360 within my organization? And do I know what my key stakeholders care about? Clients, employees, critical to retain talent, and then my shareholders. And so making sure we're very aligned on that clear priority. And step one. Step two, things that you can do right now is take a look within your organization and your supply chain is, if those are my priorities, does everything align internally and externally to those priorities? So I think people are seeing authentic effort, and they want to make sure that holistically organizations are focused on the things that they care about, and making sure that you don't have any blind spots when it comes to this and something that contradicts those priorities. And then three is a little bit of a wait and see, as far as, see how the emerging disclosures come out, see how data is starting to develop, watch that space and monitor it. And I think right now that's what we can do tomorrow, as far as the practical things that can come, and a tangible action item as far as what we can do tomorrow to move this agenda ahead.